Welcome. On this video, we will be discussing the idea of conditional statements. So what exactly are conditional statements? Well, conditional statements can be seen as statements with a hypothesis and a conclusion. Sometimes conditional statements are also known as if and then statements. The reason why they're also known as if and then statement, it's because of the way that these statements actually look like. Because the way that we're going to be creating conditional statements is we're always saying, look, if something happens, then the cause is the following. The statement that we're going to have in front of the if is what we're going to be labeled as the hypothesis. And the statement that we're going to be having after the then is what we're going to call the conclusion. Well, notice that for here we need two statements. One of them that is going to be categorized as the hypothesis and is going to be right in front of the if, and the second one being the conclusion, which is going to be right in front of the then. And we have a notation for this. The notation that we'll be having for conditional statements is pretty straightforward. It's going to be some kind of an arrow, where on the left hand side of that arrow is going to be our hypothesis. Well, let me actually use the same colors that I've been using here. So on the left hand side of the arrow, we're going to have our hypothesis statement. And on the right hand side of that arrow, we're going to have our conclusion. Sometimes it's labeled as just sometimes it's labeled as P arrow Q. But this arrow that we have here, it's an arrow that we're going to be indicating that we're going to be having a conditional statement. And whatever we have on the left hand side is what we're going to take in consideration as my hypothesis. And what we have on the right hand side is what we're going to be classifying as my conclusion. So how about we take a look at some examples and let's start creating some conditional statements. So for here, we have example number 1. Let me actually move this a little bit lower. So there it is. So here we have example 1. The first thing that we always want to do with any examples is to understand the situation here. So let's read this example and let's see what we have here. So it says, let P be statement, you are a guitar player, and let Q be another statement, you are a musician. What we want to do is we want to write a conditional statement. So this is our objective, to write down a conditional statement. So for that, we know that we need to identify a hypothesis and we need to identify a conclusion. So let's see. The way that this is written down, notice that P is the statement, you are a guitar player, and Q is the statement, you are a musician. So therefore, we can assume that the statement, you are a guitar player, is our hypothesis, and the statement, you are a musician, it's our conclusion. But remember the way that we structure conditional statements. Conditional statements they always look in the form the hypothesis, if the hypothesis, comma, then the conclusion. So if this is the case, then all we gotta do is just fill in the blanks. So if, what was my hypothesis? My hypothesis, you are a guitar player. So therefore, if you are a guitar player, comma, then you are a musician. Then what we have here in this statement right here, this is what we can define as my conditional statement. It is a statement glued together by an if and then, where the statement in front of the if it's our condition, our hypothesis, and the statement in front of the then is our conclusion. Let's try another example right here underneath it. So here we have another example, and it states, let P be you play soccer, and let Q be you are a fast runner. Let's identify, or let's write down the conditional statement and then identify the hypothesis and the conclusion. Well, we're going to try to identify it the same way that we did on our previous example. Let's start by identifying the hypothesis. Well, my hypothesis is what's considered my statement P. You play soccer. My conclusion is what's in front of the statement Q. You are a fast runner. Therefore, my conditional statement is going to look the following. If you play soccer, comma, then you are a fast runner. And what we have here, it's a conditional statement. Oops. What we have here, it's a conditional statement. How do we know it's a conditional statement? Notice that here it's a statement which is composed of a hypothesis and a conclusion, and is put together as an if and then statement. Now, we're not going to talk about if this statement is true, and that's something that we're going to be discussing on our following lesson. But as of right now, the only thing that we want to do is we want to identify the structure of conditional statements. So hopefully by now, we do have a clear grasp about how do we write down conditional statements. But we need to go one step further. Let's identify the different type of conditional statements that we might encounter. So for that, let's define the type of conditional statements. Let's start by remembering, how does conditional statements look like? Well, so far we have said that conditional statements, they're always in the form of some hypothesis. So if some hypothesis, then some conclusion. Now, let's define what a Converse statement is. A Converse statement, it's a statement where the hypothesis and the conclusion, they switch places. In other words, a Converse, it's a statement that is formed by switching the hypothesis and the conclusion. So let's take a look at the example underneath. Let's consider the conditional statement. If you are a guitar player, then you are a musician. And what we want to do is we want to write down the converse of this statement. Okay, so how do we accomplish that? Well, we need to start by identifying what is a hypothesis and what is a conclusion of the conditional statement. Well, here we know that the hypothesis, it's in front of the if statement. So you are a guitar player. This is my hypothesis. You are a musician. This is my conclusion. And I know that in order for us to have a converse statement, what we need to do is we need to switch the location for the hypothesis and the conclusion. So therefore, the converse of this given statement is going to look as such. So if you are a musician, comma, then you are a guitar player. Notice that all that we have done, we have switched the location. What was once my conclusion, now is my hypothesis. And what was my hypothesis, now is my conclusion. We have not changed anything but the location of the hypothesis and the conclusion. Now, if we want to put some kind of a notation to it, so we can say that the conditional statement, we know that the conditional statement has the form P arrow Q, then the converse. If we switch the hypothesis and the conclusion, then the converse will be Q, comma, arrow P. All we're doing, we're switching the location. Another type of conditional statement that we're going to be discussing is the idea of the inverse. The way that we're going to be defining a inverse statement, it's by saying it is a conditional statement where the hypothesis and the conclusion are negated. If we want to represent this in symbols, so let's say that we have a conditional statement P arrow Q, so therefore an inverse, since we are negating both of them, then it's going to look like not P arrow, not Q. Let's take a look at the example of the new here. So again, notice that we have the same conditional statement. If you are a guitar player, then you are a musician. But now what we want to do is we want to write down the inverse function. So how is that going to look like? Well, again, let's identify the hypothesis. So here we have our hypothesis. And here we have my conclusion. So therefore, the inverse, we're going to be negating both of them. So therefore, the inverse for this given conditional statement is going to look as if you are not a guitar player, comma, then you are not a musician. So notice that all we did, we took a look at the original conditional statement, and all we did, we negated the hypothesis, and then we negated the conclusion. The last type of conditional statement that we need to define is the contrapositive. The way that we're going to be defining a contrapositive function is that it is a conditional statement where we do two things. We negate the hypothesis and conclusion, and then we switch the location of the hypothesis and conclusion. In other words, a contrapositive, it is a combination of a inverse and the converse. Because notice that in here, by negating the hypothesis and the conclusion, we're doing the inverse. And by switching the location of the hypothesis and the conclusion, here we're doing the converse. So you can think of a contrapositive as a combination of an inverse and a function within the same conditional statement. If we want to think about this in terms of symbols, then we can think about it as follows. A conditional statement, it was given to us as P arrow Q. So therefore, the contrapositive can be think about it as not Q arrow not P, because notice that we are switching and negating. And again, the order doesn't matter. If you want to switch and then negate, that will give you the same as if you just negate and then switch. So let's take a look at the example that we have here underneath it. Let me just move this a little bit lower so that we have it. So here we have the same conditional statement. If you are a guitar player, then you are a musician. And now what we want to do is we want to write down the contrapositive statement. So how are we going to do that? The same way that we have done before. Let's identify what is my hypothesis. So here we have my hypothesis. And what is my conclusion? You are a musician. Here we have my conclusion. So what we want to do is we want to switch them and then we want to negate them. So let's do the switch first. If we switch, then this is how it's going to look like. If you are a musician, comma, then you are a guitar player. And now what we want to do is, now let's negate this. So if you are not a musician, comma, then you are not a guitar player. So here we have it. This statement that we have here, if you are not a musician, then you are not a guitar player. This statement that we have here is what we can define as the contrapositive of the given conditional statement. If you are a guitar player, then you are a musician. Now, the last thing that I do want to discuss, it is what's the relationship between a conditional statement and a contrapositive statement. And the relationship is, well, let's look at the statement. If you are a guitar player, then you are a musician. And the statement, if you are not a musician, then you are not a guitar player. Well, we can see that those two statements have the same meaning. So in terms of logic, we can always assume the following. A conditional statement will always have the same meaning as the contrapositive. For any conditional statement that you are being given, if we perform the contrapositive, those two statements will mean the same thing. And this is something that is very important for you to understand. Given any conditional statement, if we write down their contrapositive by switching and negating, we will have the same meaning. It looks different. Like if we take a look at these two statements here, if you are a guitar player, then you are a musician. It definitely does not look like if you are not a musician, then you are not a guitar player. But in terms of logic, we can claim that they have the same meaning. So this is very important. A conditional statement will always have the same meaning as the contrapositive. Hello. If you would like to continue to learn about mathematics, you can check out the videos on the left.